look at few of the national legislations also. Now here also, understand that for the examination perspective, all that is required out of you is basically latest amendments. Okay, the latest amendments which come into place and those which are in news prominently, that is something that you can look into it. But other than that, please don't start looking into the depth of each and every national legislation, because again, you will be taking up a kind of a humongous task, which frankly will be of no use at the end of the year. So that is why, take a look at the latest amendments. If let's suppose an amendment has come, try to understand why that amendment has come, what is the purpose behind it, and then after that, understand that UPSC will ask you a larger question associated with it. For example, there has been an amendment to the Forest Conservation Act. So there UPSC will ask you about what are the latest amendments, what can be done in order to increase the size of the forest area, etc. So you will have a generalistic question, concept-based question associated with these particular factual amendments. So please ensure that your basics are always in place. Okay, that will help you answer the questions in detail. Now, amongst the national legislations, we have basically discussed the portions associated with, let's suppose, the Air Act and Water Act, we have already discussed. Now, we discuss the portion of the Wildlife Act, the Wildlife Act of 1972. Now, this Wildlife Act of 1972, as we have already discussed in the portion of the conservation measures, was brought into force immediately after the Stockholm Conference, right? Immediately after the Stockholm Conference, the conclusion of the Stockholm Conference. And this was one of the first important and major legislative actions which was taken by the country in order to conserve the environment and in order to tackle the triple threats of pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. So here it was on 5th of June, environment was first discussed in the conference at Stockholm. And then after that, India immediately, the first legislative action that it took was in 1972 for the Wildlife Act. Now, the salient features, the basic properties of the act is that not only does it provide you with the details, if I talk about it, this act provides you about the detail about the protected areas, what should be the regulation in the protected areas. So when we talk about national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, when we talk about, let's suppose, tiger reserve areas, project elephant areas, all of them, they derive their legitimacy from the Wildlife Act. So while it talks about, let's suppose, yes, Femina, that is correct. While this talks about the protected areas in detail, right, various the schedules and sections, for example, section 38 deals with the protection of the areas also. It also talks about the protection and conservation of species. Conservation of species. And that conservation of species can be tackled basically by classifying the various different species based upon their threat levels that they are facing. So based upon that, the species are basically classified into various different schedules. For example, schedule 1, that means maximum protection. Okay, schedule 1 encompasses maximum conservation and maximum protection, and in that also you have part 1, part 2, then schedule 2 also. So like this, you have 6 schedules. Now here the thing that is important to notice, always have that approach. Whenever you have any kind of exception, any kind of aberration, chances are that UPSC is going to pick that up and ask you about it in the prelims exam. For example, in this Wildlife Act, you have 6 schedules. 6 schedules for the protection of the animals and plants. Now, out of them, 5 schedules deal with the conservation of animals. The 6th schedule deals with only the conservation of plant species. Now, that is an exception, odd one out of sorts. So UPSC picked that up and asked it in the prelims examination. Immediately that fear grappled amongst the minds of the candidates that, okay, then do we have to remember all the legislations, etc.? No, because it was an exception, because that year it was in discussion. That is why UPSC has picked up a question. UPSC, you won't find a trend that UPSC picks up a question which was in mention in 1999 or 2002. UPSC doesn't do that. Only the ones which are lately in discussion, that is going to be picked up. So here it provides for the formation and the establishment of wildlife advisory boards, wildlife wardens, and then also specifies the powers. Yesterday also I had told you about it, that this Wildlife Conservation Act will also end up deciding the power which is delegated to each of the officials in the deployed in the forest, right? So the chief wardens, etc., all of them, they get their power, and the power is derived from this particular legislation. Now, this created 6 schedules. Now, out of these 6 schedules, 5 of them deal with fauna, and sixth deals with flora. Okay, that is the plant species. Now, Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, that is a part of Schedule 2. So, Schedule 1 is all the species which are listed in Schedule 1. For example, let's suppose tigers, for example, elephants, for example, one-horned rhino. All the species which are listed in Schedule 1, they are granted absolute protection, and so is the case with Part 2 of the Schedule 2. Schedule 2 also has got 2 parts, that is Part 1 and Part 2. Now, Part 2, the species which are listed in Part 2, they get maximum protection. But again, let me re-emphasize, you don't have to learn, you don't have to basically start learning what are the species in Part 1 and Part 2. I'll show you the PYQ also, which has been asked in this area, so that slowly and steadily you will have a clue that, okay, which kind of questions are generally asked from these legislations, to what degree or to what extent we need to go into the depth of these legislations. Now, hunting species, for example, the species that you can hunt, basically, so there, 4 of them, for few of them where special protection is required, they are put in Schedule 2, Part 1 of Schedule 2. Big game species, small game species, that is game species. When we refer to the game species, we don't basically mean the species who can play games, but here game refers to the aspect of hunting, right? So where you need specific permits, right? You need specific permits, only then you can carry out the hunting of them, if at all. Okay, so those particular, depending upon which species, which bird species, which terrestrial animal species, for example deer, for example you have the case of nilgais, etc. Now, under what conditions can they be hunted, if they can, in which areas they can be? So that is specified in Part 1 of Schedule 2, the Schedule 3 and Schedule 4. Schedule 5 is designated for the vermin species. Now, what are vermins? Vermins, basically, it is a designation given to those particular species who, in significant larger proportion, in very large numbers, they end up creating or causing a kind of a nuisance, right? So that is, for example, let's suppose in the case of Himachal Pradesh. Now, in Himachal Pradesh, the farmers, they face the menace from the hands of the monkeys. The monkey population in that area manages to single-handedly destroy many of the various different crops, many different fruits, etc., which grow in the orchards. So that is destroyed by these. For example, in the case of the state of Bihar, in Bihar, you have the nilgai population, which again causes a substantial loss to the farmers. Now, in that case, can they straight away hunt those or straight away kill those? No, that is not allowed. So, what can the farmers do? So they request to the state government. The state government and the wildlife wardens and the chief conservator of forest in the state will write to the center. The center, after consultation, will then declare a species to be a vermin. And that means only for a designated period and only in a designated area, you can then go for a controlled killing of these species which are causing nuisances. Other than that, you cannot be able to hunt the species. For example, let's suppose monkeys, some kind of monkeys, they are declared as vermins in Himachal. Let's suppose. Now, does not mean that you can hunt out the monkey species anywhere and everywhere. You go to Mathura, you go to there, you start hunting the monkeys. No, you cannot do that. You will be punished as a result of that. So only those species which in a certain area for a certain time period they are declared as vermins, only in those areas you can carry out the controlled culling of it. So here the act empowers the state government to send a list of wild animals to the center, requesting it to declare them verming for a selective slaughter. So after that, the center approves that, right? Center approves, and then in a selective area or the permitted area for a designated period of time, selective slaughter can be carried out. That is the case for all the species declared as vermins in Schedule 5. Then Schedule 6, basically, as per the amendment of 1991, Schedule 6 included the plant species which require protection. You cannot simply go ahead and cut down the various different types of exotic plants, plants which are significantly important for the biodiversity, etc. You cannot simply go ahead and start cutting them or start plucking them out. Now, the Act also provides for the setting up of national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, Central Zoo Authority. All of them, their legitimacy, their authority is derived from the Act in itself. Now, it also supported UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program. Yesterday, we studied about the biosphere reserves. So, that is also supported by it. Now, this Wildlife Act was amended last year in 2022. Now, the purpose of the amendment was very simple. Understand that when we talk about the international obligations, the international conventions, in many of them we have seen that you do need your own national laws in order to promote that kind of a conservation and protection. For example, take the case of CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the CITES that we have studied. Now, when we talk about CITES, now, in the case of the Convention of CITES, we do know that in order to prevent that trade from happening, illegal trade from happening, you do need to provide a kind of your own national laws to prohibit them. For example, in our case, you do have the Wildlife Act, which talks about maximum conservation, maximum protection, Schedule 1 prohibits the trade, etc. But that needs to be spruced up time and time again. Now, because India's legislation was not very strong enough and not very clearly demarcated enough, there are enough loopholes which people exploit in order to carry out trade in the name of research, etc. They do carry out illegally. Now, for that, sites had blacklisted India once before. Now, in order to avoid that, 2022 was when we amended this particular Wildlife Act in order to escape that kind of banning or blacklisting by sites again. So here, protection of endangered species. So here, the amount of punishment given for illegal wildlife trade, that has been enhanced, that has been substantially increased. Financial penalties have also been increased. The penalties associated with imprisonment, that has also been escalated. Now, better management of protected areas. So certain permitted activities like grazing or movement of livestock and bona fide use of household and drinking water by the local communities there has been a permission given for that also, so that the local community, please understand, if you alienate the local community from the process of conservation, you are doing a great damage, because then if the local community does not have the incentive to conserve, the incentive to protect, then the hunters and the poachers will always find it very easy to hunt down any of the species out there. Right. Then protection of forest lands. right? So that has also been provided. The rights of the people has to be respected in that case. Now, what are the amendments? Now, amendments here proposed a new schedule for species listed under the appendices under CITES, right? So there, to, as I told you, to avoid the blacklisting by CITES again, that is why this amendment was put into place. Now, that new appendix which will be created will be with regards to those particular species which are accorded the highest degree of protection under CITES. Now, to allow the central government to appoint a scientific authority to provide guidance on matters relating to impact of survival of specimens on being traded. Remember, when we talk about, again, as per the convention of CITES, we talked about the fact that even if you are carrying out, let's suppose, a trade, right, from a country A to a country B, let's suppose you are carrying out a trade. Now, in that case, you need to be able to, basically, the country which is sending that species to another country, that is, if A is sending, let's suppose, certain species to B, now in that case, A is going to be responsible in order to ensure the survivability of that particular animal or a species. And there you need a scientific advisory committee which will give you the detailing of it, which will talk about the fact finding of it, that what will be the impact, what are the issues associated. So that is where you have the establishment of a scientific authority, right? Are there a specific? No, Aditya, no. Then the bill also empowers the central government to, again, stop import, the trade, prevent a kind of a regulation for the import trade of invasive alien species. Because remember, as per the goals of CBD, we had basically in the conference of parties of CBD, the COP15, you had a consensus which was arrived at, where the world talked about to reduce the impact of invasive alien species by 50% by the year 2030. So that is basically, again, why this amendment has brought into place. No, biosphere reserves, they get their legitimacy from the Biodiversity Act 2002, Gaurav. It enhances the penalties, as we have talked about. So these are the few amendments which have been brought into place for the Wildlife Act. Okay, so this can be relevant for your examination, prelims examination, but that too has happened in 2022. So the chances for them being asked in 2024 mains examination automatically reduces. Then when we talk about the Forest Act, now, Forest Act here, what does that mean? So, when we talk about the Forest Act, here, Forest Act earlier was the, if you talk about the genesis of the Forest Acts. Now, Forest Acts to some extent or the other had been brought ever since the 1800s, 1860s onwards by the British government. And at that point of time, the purpose was very much to restrict the access of us Indians into the forest areas, so that the local community does not get an unhindered access into the forest areas, etc. So for that purpose, you had the Forest Acts of the 1800s which were passed. Now, in 1927, the Forest Act which was passed was primarily, the entire premise of it was to control the forest resources, right? The Britishers, they were so very paranoid that maybe we local Indians, we basically start exploiting the forest resources, and they always thought that they had the first right over the resources. And that is when the objective was to manage timber and other forest resources, provided for the state government to notify any forest land as reserved or protected forest, and all the rights in such kind of a land basically are subject to the provisions that if you have a reserved forest, entry is prohibited. If you have a reserved forest, then these kind of activities cannot be allowed. For example, mining cannot be allowed. For example, geological exploration in those areas cannot be allowed. So those were few of the details of the 1927 Act. Now, this is just to tell you what was the brief basic background of that. Then Forest Act was then passed, a comprehensive Forest Act was passed in 1980. And the 1980 Forest Act which was passed, it was enacted to prevent the large scale deforestation. It basically required the central government's approval for any diversion of forest land for non-forest purposes. Okay, that did require a central government approval. Now, this act basically meant that this was used by many of the state governments in a different manner. For example, what is a land that you declare as a forest? Let's suppose you declare this land as a forest. So here many activities, economic activities will be prohibited. For example, mining, etc. That will be prohibited in the forest act, forest region. Even development of infrastructure activities will be prohibited. So what the state governments they started doing is they started basically declaring certain areas as non-forest land, right? So they started declaring certain areas as non-forest. And then in those areas, they allowed the economic processes to carry on. That is where a large scale deforestation exercise and activities were observed all across the country. Now, this matter was dragged to the doorsteps of the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court, in a landmark judgment in 1996, what is also referred to as the Godavarman case, Godavarman case, Godavarman case of 1996. So Supreme Court, as per this Godavarman case of 1996, basically issued a judgment which was in a way quite significant to conserve the environment, but in a way it imposed such a severe regulation and restriction that construction of anything, even if let's suppose you want to basically build a water supply source in any of the habitations in the forest, you cannot do that because you'll need to cut trees, etc. So what is it that Supreme Court said? Supreme Court said that, look, what is the purpose of forest acts, all these forest acts that you are passing, the central government, state governments, all the regulations, what is the purpose of it? So the purpose is very simple: to increase the forest cover. And basically, not only to increase the forest cover, but to prevent deforestation. Now, Supreme Court asked the central government also that what do you mean by deforestation? So the central government basically in its submission replied that deforestation means in the existing forest land, if they're cutting down of trees, that is deforestation, which is not allowed. But Supreme Court basically held the opinion that why only in the forest land the cutting of trees should be referred to as deforestation. Go for the dictionary meaning of deforestation. That is, anywhere if there is cutting down of the trees, that should not be allowed. Now, this was quite a significant impediment. While it talked about the conservation of the forest, but basically if you build a very stringent regulation that I won't allow anyone to go in the forest, that is not a conservation which you will be able to carry out for a very long. People will use that, or illegally they will basically exploit what they have to exploit. So that is why under the judgment of the Godavarman case, which was arrived at 12th of December 1996, you had a situation where that deforestation that was brought to a complete standstill, agreed. But then this also meant that building of infrastructure, let's suppose in the border areas, let's suppose you want to build a kind of a strategic defense setup. Now, if you talk about the regions such as Arunachal, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, they are densely forested. Now, if you have to construct anything, you have to cut down certain trees, but that is not allowed, right? If let's suppose in a forest you have certain habitations, now those habitations, they are not connected with each other. You have to build an infrastructure to connect them. Again, you cannot do that. Maybe it will involve cutting down of trees. So that is where the aspect of economy versus ecology, that again came to the loggerheads. As a result of that, many of the illegal activities were also carried out. And that is why the amendment was brought into place in 2023. In 2023, the amendment which was brought this year by the government. Now, before any amendment is brought to the parliament, before any act, any bill is brought to the doorsteps of the parliament, that bill or that particular amendment consists a mission to or the purpose of it, the objective that has to be achieved, etc. Now, the objective which was stated as per this amendment was that we have to increase the forest cover of the country. We have to increase the forest cover of the country to ensure that there is a substantial amount of increase in green cover. And India in 1998 had declared a forest policy, national forest policy. Now, as per that national forest policy of 1988, India had declared a kind of an aim that we are going to bring 33% of geographical area of the land area under forest. We are still at around 24.5% is the extent of forest land as per the Forest Survey report of 2021. We are still at 24.5%. 17 states, they have achieved this target of 33%. Rest of them, they have not. So that is why when this was brought about, the government said that its slated or its stated objective is that we have to increase the forest cover. At the same time, we have to ensure development. We have to ensure that India's preparedness at the border doesn't take a hit. So these were the various issues that basically were given as the slated objectives. Having said that, if you take a look at the amendments brought into the place, it provides for substantial amount of loopholes which can be exploited in order to divert the forest land. For example, here these include, now this basically amendment said that the Forest Act will be applicable only to certain type of land. It won't be applicable to all the land, all the forest land. It will be applicable only to certain type of land. So which type of land? So land notified as a forest either under the Forest Act of 1927 or in government records after 1980 Act came into place. The act will not be applicable. The act will not be applicable to the land converted for non-forest use before December 12, 1996. This is the date of the Godavarman judgment. Godavarman judgment. Now, what this basically is, the implication of it is that, look, from 1980 up till 1996 or before that also, due to the various different processes of the state government, many of these non-forest lands or forest lands have been diverted into non-forest lands. Their mining processes, etc., have been carried out for decades now. Now you cannot bring them and drag those companies to court that, look, you are carrying out deforestation in a designated forest land. Okay, now you cannot drag them to the court. Now those land are exempt from it now, which have been diverted before. After that, all the land basically which is notified as a forest would be covered under the Forest Act. The regulations of the Forest Act, the restrictions placed by the Forest Act, they will be placed under regulation, but not the land which was diverted before the Godavarman judgment. Now, exempt certain type of land from the purview of the act. Which type of land? So basically, from 100 kilometers of the Indian border, where you have certain, let's suppose, construction activities required for national security projects, small roadside amenities, and also public roads leading to habitations. Now, for these, you have an exemption which is provided. Now, the argument on the side of the government is that, look, for example, if we need to construct a border installation, or if we are planning to construct, the government, as you must be aware, is in the way of or is in the process of constructing 1,000-kilometer long frontier highway across the northeastern region, around the region of Arunachal, in order to bolster our defense preparedness. Right? The government is in process of implementing that. Now, that if it comes and falls within 100-kilometer of the border areas, you cannot expect that the defense requirements or the strategic requirements of the country, they are put to the question, and you only allow that the trees should not be cut in that area. But the side or the counter argument which the activists, etc., opposition has put into place is the fact that if you talk about regions such as, let's suppose, Jammu Kashmir, if you talk about regions such as Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, if you talk about regions such as Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Tripura, when you talk about 100 kilometers from border areas, you are talking about very critical ecosystems, right? And these critical ecosystems, if you have no permit or if you don't have any regulation in these areas, you can carry out a substantial scale of deforestation, right? So there also you need to basically go for a kind of a selective approval of project, is what the other side argues. But the side or the argument on the side of the government has always been that, look, we cannot compromise on this matter and this is required. Okay, now you have to be aware of both sides of the argument in general. So, small roadside amenities have also been allowed. This is for public convenience. Habitation, small roads connecting the habitations, right? So, that is also a kind of a public amenity. So, for this also, if you, let's say, the counter argument is if you start providing exemptions for this, you might end up providing exemptions for a large scale or a large number of projects, which again will defy the purpose of having a forest act at all. The state governments require prior approval of the central government to assign any forest land to a private entity. Now, this was not the case earlier. Now, that is why this was a regulation or this was a clause in the bill which none of the state governments, particularly obviously the ones in the position, they did not like this, because as per them, the central government is actually grabbing that jurisdiction away from the state government. But the argument of the central government has been that, look, earlier from 1980 onwards, you have diverted a lot of forest land to the private entities without any regulation. There have been malified intentions and economic gains which have been created in many of the states. For example, northeastern states have experienced massive level of deforestation because of that illegal transfer of the forest land. So that is where the central government is saying that now take approval for us from us. But then the state governments also, they are right, a bit correct in that you cannot centralize this power to yourself. You need to give this power to us also. Okay. Now, another point which was in contention, that some activities that can be carried out in forest, such as establishing checkpost, fencing, and bridges, they are allowed. It allows for running of zoos, safaris, and ecotourism facilities. That can be allowed. Now, here also the counter argument is that in the region of a forest, why do you need a zoo? In a region of a forest, what is the purpose of a zoo? And then, if you start constructing zoos there, you will have to create amenities, infrastructure to connect that zoo, isn't it? That means large scale deforestation. That means population pressure on the forest land, right? So that has been the counter argument. But the argument which has been posed by the government has been that, look, we cannot keep the forests of the country unless we cannot preserve the forest unless you have massive level of awareness. And when will you develop an awareness? When you will have the situation where people frequently end up having, let's suppose they go to the forest, you encourage people to go to the forest. And that can be promoted with the help of ecotourism facilities, that can be promoted with the help of, let's say, safaris, etc. And there, government is keen on exploiting the ecotourism potential of areas such as Andaman Nicobar, of areas such as even Jammu Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh. But then also that is fraught with a lot of risk of environmental degradation and damage which can be created. Okay. So that is basically, these are the basic amendments of 2023. And I have provided you with the arguments and the counter arguments. So if, let's suppose, a question comes for critically analyze the amendments of 2020 Forest Act 2023 or Forest Amendment 2023, ideally, you should be providing what is the logic behind these arguments, and also what are the challenges going ahead into the future that the government will face. So for that, you will have to highlight that okay, in these areas there can be a diversion, there is a loophole where, let's suppose, 100 kilometer from border, if you're talking about a very large area. Himachal shares its border on both sides, so you're talking about a very large area. Maharashtra Konkan coast, if you're talking about 100 kilometers from the border, you are talking about very critical ecosystem, right? Manipur, Nagaland, Tripura, Mizoram, 100 kilometers from the border, you're talking about a very large area. So you cannot have that kind of a sweeping approach. You need to have a selective approach in that case. Okay, so that critical analysis type of a question you need to be prepared for. Okay. No, forest cover and green cover is not the same. Are we aware about what is defined as a forest cover? We have covered it in the geography class. Are we aware about this? What is regarded as a forest cover? So, in case you have a tree, let's suppose, a region with a trees, canopy density of greater than 10%, right? So, in any area greater than 1 hectare, canopy density higher than 10%, right? So that is basically, after that, that region is regarded as a forest, but it has to be declared as a forest land by the state government also. Okay, that declaration has to happen for that region to be a forest, declared as a kind of a forest land. Okay, so that is the minimum requirement. Other than that, if let's suppose in an area you have 50, 100 trees, you can declare it as a green cover. For example, in whichever city you are living, you will have green patches within your city. You cannot call them as a forest, can you? So that is where it is basically regarded as the green cover. For example, in Delhi, if you go to the region of Delhi, now in the western part of Delhi, you have the ridge area, southwestern part of Delhi. Now, there, in certain areas, in large sections, you have undisturbed land where the canopy density is around more than 10%. And basically, where the canopy cover is more than 10%, you'll find that people refer to it as a reserved forest area. There, it is not allowed. Activities are not permitted in that area. Construction activities, human intervention, general, is not allowed in those areas. So that is basically the reserved forest, which is declared as per the Act. Then you had the Environment Protection Act of 1986. This Environment Protection Act of 1986 basically was brought into place in order to provide a kind of a comprehensive umbrella sort of legislation for everything dealing with environment. This significantly increased the power of the Central Pollution Control Board also, quite significantly increased the power of CPCB. And the purpose of the act is to implement the decisions of the United Nations Conference on Human Environment held at Stockholm in June 1972. Now, there, it is an umbrella for the legislations designed to provide a framework for central government, coordination of activities of various central and state authorities established under the earlier Act of Water and Air Act. So, in this case, yes, Kamalpal, that is correct. The Kant area around Delhi. So, in this case, the earlier provisions which had been brought about by the 1974 Water Act and the 1981 Air Act, now, these basic acts provided some amount of power to the CPCB. That CPCB will have the power or the purview to be able to establish the emission norms. Then the CPCB will be coordinating with the state pollution control boards, etc. That was the power given to them. So, this act provided an increased jurisdiction to the CPCB also. Now, it gave the central government authority to issue orders, including orders to close, prohibit, or regulate any industry in order if they are not meeting the required norms or what are the required emission levels, etc. If they're not meeting the norms, then basically the central government can issue closure orders for those. They can basically stop the supply of water, electricity, etc. That can also be done. Any official, forest official, let's suppose, or any official, government official, If that official brings about the closure of any kind of an act, let's suppose closure of an industry, let's suppose that official brings about cessation of water supply, stops the water supply to an industry because the industry is not adhering to the norms. Now you cannot penalize that official if that official has taken that step under the provisions of the Environment Act. For example, let's suppose we talk about leather tanneries in Kanpur. Now, these leather tanneries, they are one of the bigger pollutant source to River Ganga. They discharge chromium, significant amount of chromium into River Ganga. Now, let's suppose you as a government official, you go to that particular factory or a tannery and you find that they are exceeding the norms of emission and you order the shutdown of that industry. Now, basically, let's suppose the shutdown of the industry means there's a huge financial loss and maybe 1,000 people they get unemployed. Now, one out of them can stand up and file a case against you that because of that official, I have lost my job. Because of that official, now I am in an economically impoverished state. Because of that official, I don't know what to do, and I have had various damages, so that official is liable. You, as an official, will be immune from any action if that preventive step or that action that you took of closure of the industries is as per the Environment Act. You will be immune from any action, right? So the act grants immunity to the officers of the government for any of the act done under the provisions of Environment Act 1986 or under the powers vested in them or functions assigned to them under this Environment Act of 1986. They are immune from it. They have a kind of an immunity so that they can carry out their work in an impartial manner. Okay, so that they can carry out their functioning in an impartial manner. Now, then we had the Biodiversity Act 2002, which was passed. Now, this Biodiversity Act basically was passed in order to adhere to the norms of CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, if you take a look at it, what were the objectives of CBD? CBD had three objectives, if you remember. So, first was conservation of biodiversity, conservation of biodiversity. What was the other objective? Sustainable use of biodiversity, including the LMOs and the development done by the biotechnology to provide a kind of a biosafety, sustainable use of components of biodiversity, and then also it was about fair and equitable. Very good. Sharing of benefits. Isn't it? These were the three objectives of CBD. It is for this, the sustainable use, that CBD had passed which particular protocol? I will make you repeat so many times that it sticks to your mind. For this particular sustainable use of components, what was the protocol? No, not Nagoya, Cartagena. Very good. For this, you had Cartagena. And for fair and equitable sharing of benefits, you had Nagoya Protocol. Okay. Now, look at the objectives of this act and find the similarity. So, the act provides for conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the use of biodiversity and the knowledge arising, traditional knowledge of biodiversity. So the objectives of the act, the aim of the act is absolutely similar as compared to the CBD. Absolutely same. And that is basically to implement the provisions of CBD. This is the reason why even Wildlife Act was amended. Because once, if you are a responsible nation, if you are a responsible party to the Committee of Nations, where you have, let's suppose, decided that along with the entire global community, you have to cater to the environmental requirements and the needs of the time. You have to ensure that poaching, hunting, etc. does not take place. You have to ensure that the biodiversity is preserved, etc. Now, if you are a party to these conventions, it would be absolutely irresponsible of you as a country that you are a party to those legislations or those conventions, but your legislations are not strong enough, or your legislations don't have those provisions. As a country, at a domestic level, you should have those particular kind of conventions and norms. So this is the reason why Wildlife Act was amended in order to adhere to the norms of sites, and this is why Biodiversity Act was passed in order to adhere to the norms of CBD. Now, what this did basically was it allowed for the establishment of biodiversity committees at the district level, at the state level, and at the national level. National Biodiversity Authority, State Biodiversity Authority, and Biodiversity Management Committees at the district level. Now, if let's suppose I want to carry out a research in the region of Uttarakhand on some of the plant species, now, if in that case there will be a transfer of knowledge, let's suppose I am partnering with a German pharmaceutical firm and there might be a transfer of knowledge to that German company, I will need an approval of the National Biodiversity Authority so as to ensure that fair and equitable sharing of the benefits is happening, right? So there is a requirement of, even in the research papers, if I'm publishing that for the world, I need to get an approval. Okay, so here the main intent is to protect India's rich biodiversity. Now, this act provides for setting up of National Biodiversity Authority at the central level, state biodiversity boards at the state level, and the biodiversity management committees in the local bodies. Okay, so a kind of a decentralized system where you have accountability affixed right up to the state level. All foreign nationals or organizations, they require prior approval of National Biodiversity Authority for obtaining biological resources and associated knowledge of any use. Indian individuals and Indian individual entities require approval of NBA, National Biodiversity Authority, for transferring results of research to any of the organizations, international, nationals, or organization. You need that authority to be in place. Okay, so here also just understand the basic premise of this Biodiversity Act is basically to implement the norms and the objectives of CBD at the state level. Then you have the CRZ, that is the Coastal Regulation Zone. Now, the coastlines, they represent a very fragile ecosystem. Now, these coastlines, that is where you basically have the prime real estate also. So there also, it has always been a kind of a tiff between development and also the conservation of the coastline, conservation of the coastal ecosystem. Now, for this, in 1991, the government issued notification as per the provisions of the Environment Act that to protect and conserve the environment and ecosystem of the coastline of the country, the coastal land up to 500 meters of the high tide line. We have discussed what is the high tide and the low tide line and the intertidal zone. If let's suppose this is the water level, high tide, the conditions of high tide, wherever the water comes in, the conditions of low tide, the extent to which the water goes. So this is your high tide line and this is your low tide line. So 500 meters from the high tide line, that is a kind of an ecotone area, obviously. It is not exactly terrestrial, it is not exactly maritime. So there, coastal land up to 500 meters from the high tide line and a stage of 100 meter along the banks of the estuaries, creeks, backwaters, etc. There also you have the areas regulated under the coastal regulation zone. Wherever you have fluctuations of the tide, etc., you have coastal regulation zone. There was a demarcation which had been done in 2011 of these coastal areas about what kind of development, etc., can be carried out. And accordingly, you had the categorization which was done. For example, if you talk about it, in CRZ1, no construction is allowed other than basically the construction of roads and trans-harbor sea links, right? That don't affect the tidal flow and are between high tide and low tide line. Projects related to Department of Economic Energy, atomic energy. Remember, and I don't know how many of you are able to recall that. For example, Kudankulam nuclear power plant, when it was being established, it was being established closer to the coastline. You had huge amount of protest associated with that for a long period of time. You had very huge amount of protest associated. Later on, it was found out in the Intelligence Bureau, in its submission to the Supreme Court, basically said that much of this protest was fueled by money coming from US, because Kudankulam was being built with the help of the Russian help and the Russian reactors. And the US companies wanted that that should stop and India should use US reactors. So oftentimes there is a lot of, in these various different kinds of massive blockages, there are oftentimes various different forces behind the scenes acting also. Now, there an exception has been provided to the Department of Atomic Energy because it has been thought to be critical, both for the strategic independence and also for the energy security of the country. Other permissions for natural gas exploration and extraction, because, for example, if you talk about the crude oil in the Krishna Godavari basin, now that crude oil exploration mostly you will carry out in the region of this high intertidal zone or in the region of the continental shelf, right? So salt manufacturing, desalinization plant, in order to convert that salty seawater into fresh water. So there are some exceptions. Only few things are allowed. CRZ2, basically permissions for building construction is required on the landward side. Desalination plants also you require permissions, and the permissions are granted. CRZ3, there also only certain areas, petroleum products, salt manufacture, public facility products. So like that, you had the zonation. This was basically done in 2011. In 2018, what was done? That the CRZ1 or Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3, Zone 4, this was basically amended. Now here, rather than one encompassing CRZ1A, or rather than the entire CRZ1, which was the condition of 2011, you had the classification of the coastal area into CRZ1A and 1B. So what is 1A and 1B? Observe this. So this is the eco-sensitive zones, right? Eco-sensitive areas, that is across the coastal areas, that is designated as 1A. Then 1B, intertidal areas, intertidal zone, that is included under 1B. That is the kind of delineation which has been done. Here also massive restrictions have been put into picture. Now, then CRZ2 remains as is the case with the 2011 notification. This is the region of CRZ2. So areas which have been developed up to or close to the shore. For example, if you go to Chennai, if you go to Kolkata, if you go to Mumbai, if you go to Vishakhapatnam, if you go to Goa, now it is the case that in many of the areas closer to the coastline, you have the presence of some human habitations, right? Some habitations, some settlements are there. So that is included in that CRZ2. Areas which have been developed close to the shore. So here also prohibitions, they remain. For example, what are the prohibitions? That permissions will be granted only in certain case for certain infrastructure construction activities, desalination plants, etc. Then CRZ3, which was the populated area across the coastline, that has again been divided into CRZ3A and 3B. Why this was done was, basically it was found out that because of the coastal regulation zones, it has become impossible for development of infrastructure in the public settled areas, right? Those of you living in the coastal towns, you would basically adhere to the fact that not much development of sewage treatment plants, etc., has happened in the coastal towns for some time. And the reason behind that is that they lie under the provisions of the CRZ where construction activities are not allowed. Now, here there has been a declassification, a kind of a classification, subclassification into CRZ3A, CRZ3B. So, CRZ3 areas where the population density is less than 2161 people per square kilometer as per the 2011 census, they have been put under 3A. And where the density, or rather in this case, the density is more than 2161, population density higher than 2161 per square kilometer as per 2011 census. In those areas, some amount of infrastructure, building, etc. can be carried out. CRZ3B, where the population habitation or the population density is less. Density is less. Right? CRZ4, which under the 2011 notifications included the areas of the water body. So here, this was the CRZ4 as per 2011 regulations, where no construction was allowed, only traditional fishing mechanisms, etc. were allowed. Now, that remains, but there has been a classification, further subclassification as well. CRZ4A, 12 nautical miles from the LTL, that is the low tide line. LTL represents the low tide line, HTL the high tide line. So 12 nautical miles from the low tide line, that is 4A. Traditional fishing is allowed, not much of a construction, no construction is allowed in this particular scenario. So that is CRZ 4A. But let's suppose there is a backwater. Let's suppose there is a kind of an estuary. Let's suppose there is a kind of a swamp or a marsh there. Now, is there a specific provision, or there was not a specific provision earlier for those? Now, in this case, those have been put under CRZ 4B. That is tidal influenced water bodies, that is backwaters, etc. They have been put under regulation under this CRZ 4B. Right. Now, in this case, no development zone, 50 meters from high tide line in CRZ 3A areas, 200 meters from high tide line in CRZ 3B areas. You cannot develop anything. Now, 50 meters from high tide line, the activists, they are saying that now you will have hotels getting built up 50 meters from the high tide line, which is absolutely unsafe, etc. But that is the counter argument, is that you do require some development. And understand the concept of it. The concept, where is it that this kind of a dilution of CRZ came from? When we talk about the CRZ, right? When we talk about the CRZ, now in Mumbai, for example, take the case of Mumbai. Now, Mumbai is one of those cities which is in acute need of infrastructural development, acute need of infrastructure. Public infrastructure in Mumbai is something which was designed for decades back, long time back. The public infrastructure as of now in Mumbai, if you look at it, including all the highways, including all the... Now, that does not allow mobility of people from one region to another. As a result of that, there has been a huge disparity in settlement. And many of the areas, for example, the Thane Creek, in those areas, no development has happened for a very, very long period of time. So Mumbai is one of those cities which is crumbling under the pressure of the population without any infrastructure. Long traffic jams, etc. have been a norm. Now, Mumbai is a coastal area. You cannot develop anything because you will be violating the CRZ norms. So it is because of that whenever the coastal road project, the coastal highway project of Mumbai, whenever that was mooted, many of the metro rail projects, whenever it was floated forward, immediately the courts were able to shut it down due to a litigation, or people would be able to drag the BMC to the court, municipal corporation to the court, that you are violating the CRZ norms. As a result of that, many of these developmental projects could not simply take off. And Mumbai requires that development. You cannot have a city designed in 1900 as per the requirements of 1900s, that, this is a good city. If because I am living here for 60 years, that point of time it was very nice. Fair enough. At that point of time, you did not have that much population. The population in Mumbai growing at a rate that it is, and you cannot prevent people from coming into that city, can you? A person from Delhi, if let's suppose their job gets transferred to Mumbai, you cannot prevent them from coming, that no, this will add to the population of Mumbai. You cannot do that. But for that, you do need that infrastructure to support them. You need people to be able to commute from one area to another, so that people can live at far off places and get to work in a short span of time. And that means the affordability of that place will also happen. So that is why you had this entire concept which brought about some amount of dilution. Now, the side effect of it is, ever since this has been declared, there has been many of the loopholes which are being exploited at the local level, many of the loopholes which are being talked about at the local level in the coastline, 7,000-kilometer long coastline of the country. And that means a threat to the coastal ecosystem, the mangrove ecosystem, etc. They can get threatened. Now, as per the new CRZ norms of 2018, only such projects or activities which are located in CRZ 1 and CRZ 4, that is, area covered between the LTL and 12 nautical miles seaward, will be required to be declared by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. For CRZ2 in urban areas and CRZ3 in rural areas, that clearance will be provided at the state level itself by the Coastal Zone Management Authority. Now, temporary tourism facilities such as shacks, right? In the coastlines, you have shacks, toilet blocks, change rooms, drinking water facilities have now been permitted. Earlier, even these were not allowed. So think about it. If you don't have these basic amenities, there can be a lot of untoward incident of pollution, etc. being caused. And people won't visit that area. People won't visit, you won't go with your family to an area where you don't have any changing rooms for a very long distance, you don't have any drinking water facilities. You will generally find backpackers going there, and the amount of pollution to the sea will be there. So that is why these need to be constructed. Such temporary tourism facilities are also now permitted in the no development zone of CRZ3 areas as per the notification. However, it has to be at a distance of 10 meters minimum from the high tide line, depending upon the region, etc. So this is to improve the facilities of tourism, to improve the benefits to the local population, and also to improve the public amenities that you provide in the coastal area. What is the benefit of high tide line? Chandrasekhar, it is a question that you have asked is, what is the benefit of sea level? Tell me the benefit of sea level. What do you think is the benefit of a sea level? Will the sea level have any benefit? No. What is the benefit of atmospheric pressure? Is there benefit of atmospheric pressure? No. So when we say high tide line is basically the level up till which the water will come during the high tides. Low tide line is the level to which the water will come during the low tides. This is a natural phenomena. Every coastline will have a high tide line. Every coastline will have a low tide line. In between these areas, you find a kind of a marshland, mangroves in many of the regions. You will find critical ecosystems in that area thriving in that region. Many of the amphibians, etc., they will go into these areas to lay their eggs. The young ones will hatch. So that is why it is always considered to be a kind of a no development zone. That is the benefit of it. Okay. As can be seen in the case of China, there they constructed roads and streets atop buildings and then further infrastructure upon these roads and streets. Could this be implemented to use? China has done this in few of the areas. That is true, but you cannot implement such things in India, for example, because in India now you will have. First of all, you cannot displace the population even if you want construction of a highway, etc. There also displacement of population is fraught with risk. So that implementing that on a scale that China has done, only China can do. Even US cannot do that. Even Europe cannot do that. Basically, it is the aspect of what you impose upon the citizens. You impose upon the citizens that no, in the region of China can do that. China can say that, okay, Kanpur is a polluting area for Ganga. I will shut down all the industries, all the people from that region. If let's suppose Varanasi is the clustered habitation, do one thing, I will bulldoze all the regions, I will take every people out of there, I will settle you 100 kilometers down from Varanasi, and I will build tall skyscrapers there. You will have to live there. People do that in China. Try doing that in India. Look at the consequence. You cannot do that, and that should not be done. You cannot impose that on the citizens. That is why it is very, very impractical in India. Now, a couple of initiatives that the government launched this last month. Before the conference of parties was being held, the government declared a couple of initiatives in order to improve the environmental adherences and the environmental friendly conditions. That is Green Credit Program and the Eco-Mark scheme. So when we talk about the Green Credit Program, it basically focuses on two activities. That is basically water conservation and afforestation. Right? Water conservation and afforestation. Now, the Green Credit Program is again a credit program, market-based mechanism to incentivize voluntary environment actions across diverse sectors by stakeholders like individuals, communities, private industries, and companies. All of that is a part of Green Credit Program, right? So individuals also think about it. So individuals, basically communities, a group of people, private sector, all of them, they can now earn credit if they carry out a designated area in a designated area or a designated process of conservation and deforestation. You can earn credit which you can sell to whosoever requires that credit, whosoever has that target. Let's suppose a company has got a target that you have to carry out afforestation or reforestation for 10 square kilometer. Let's suppose you have a particular company, a startup, which is specializing in that. You have carried out afforestation or reforestation for 100 square kilometer, and you have been given 100 credits for that. So you can sell that 10 credits to them, right? So the GCP's governance framework is supported by an interministerial steering committee and the Indian Council of Forest Research and Education. Now, Indian Council of Forest Research and Education, that serves as the administrator for the Green Credit Program, that is relevant for your prelims, responsible for the implementation, monitoring, management, and the operation of this program. Now, in order to obtain green credits, individuals and entities must register their activities through the central government's dedicated app or website, which is this. And the administrator then, which is the administrator, this is the administrator, Indian Council of Forest Research and Education. The administrator will verify the activity through a designated agency that it will pick with self-verification for a very small size project. Once verification is complete, administrator will grant a green credit certificate, which will be tradable at a green credit platform. So that is basically your green credit program, relevant for your prelims, very relevant for your prelims. Okay. Then simultaneously, government also launched what it referred to as the Eco-Mark scheme. What was the Eco-Mark scheme? Promoting eco-friendly products. So accreditation and labeling for household and consumer products, right, which are ecologically friendly, that meet certain specific environmental criteria while maintaining quality standards as per Indian norms, not European norms, Indian norms. Products accredited under the scheme will adhere to specific environmental criteria, meaning that they have not disturbed the environment. It will build consumer awareness of the environmental issues and encourage conscious choices, or basically eco-conscious choices, or basically responsible consumption. The concept is very simple. If you and I, we become conscious that, let's suppose, if I buy any of the product, let's suppose if I buy certain apparel, certain bags, certain products which are eco-friendly, if we make that choice in our lives that we will buy only those products, then the producers will also, the manufacturers will also start using eco-friendly methodology because they want to sell it. So responsible consumption will lead to responsible production. That is the basic concept of it. That responsible consumption will lead to responsible production. And that will lead to eco-friendly conditions and environmental friendly actions. It will motivate manufacturers to shift towards, as we told, environmental friendly production. And the scheme seeks to ensure accurate labeling and prevent misleading information. Now, what is relevant for your prelims here? The CPCB administers the EcoMark scheme in partnership with BIS, Bureau of Indian Standard, which is the national body for standards and certification. Okay, that is the case for EcoMark scheme. These have been declared very recently. In the month of October, notification was issued. Around 14th of October, if I'm not mistaken, is when the notification was issued. And this implementation of it, we will see it in the next half year. Let's see which products are designated as per the EcoMark. Okay. Now, Gaurav, can we build permanent facility in NDZ, or mostly the kind of temporary facilities? Permanent facilities are not allowed, Gaurav. Shiva, recently, Pondicherry also developed tourism facilities near. Is these amendments provided way for that development? Yes, Shiva. In all the coastal areas, basically you had substantial lack of amenities, substantial lack of connectivity in the coastal areas. So after 2018, this has developed some kind of an accelerated action plan, but then obviously this is being misused in certain areas where the as the citizens, as the responsible citizens, and as the state governments, the local bodies, they have to be aware that where that misuse is happening does not mean that you don't provide facilities for individuals and there are no toilets, no drinking water supply across the coastline. So what that leads to, is basically you will find some of the vendors in the coastlines across the beaches, they will sell you spurious and adulterated products at a very high price. You don't have drinking water supply there, so they will give you a packaged drinking water, which is again doubtful in terms of how clean it is. They will sell you at 50, 100 rupees. Now, that is again what you are doing. You are basically promoting a kind of activity, or you are promoting a kind of a process where people will start disposing of plastic waste in the coastline. So provide the basic facilities to the people and pollution will automatically be taken care of. Then Tanmay, if we observe major developed cities across the world like Tokyo, New York, Los Angeles, Mexico, etc., are on the coastline, yes. Then why can't Mumbai be as developed as them? Why only Mumbai have to follow the? That is basically the thing that, see, understand. Mumbai is Mumbai. You can have lot of similarities drawn from New York, not so much as Tokyo and other areas, not even Shanghai, but you can draw similarities from New York. Why? Because just like New York, Mumbai also has a lot of marshlands. I hope you are aware that Mumbai basically was a group of 7 islands, right? And it was not connected to the mainland. It was basically deposition and eventual reclamation of land. Basically, you put sediments, etc., together to join it to the mainland. Now, this was done more than 100 years ago. Now, even in New York was an area of marshes. Now, as the population pressure increased, New York is also the financial capital of US. Mumbai is also the financial capital of the country. As the pressure increased, what US could do ably well, US could shift its focus to the economic areas and the economic development. Tall skyscrapers started coming in, and as soon as they realized that New York is getting too much clustered, population pressure is choking down the city. Even now, if you go to New York, basically you will come across the scenarios of from the sewers, gas getting released, that foul, pungent smell on the streets will be common. But what they did was, when they realized that this is becoming too much, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, it will almost be intolerable. Now, they started reclaiming that marshland, some area of that marshland. They deposited sediment into that, and then they started constructing buildings there. That is the region that today we refer to as the Manhattan area of New York, basically where you have all the Fifth Ave and the various important business district of New York is in Manhattan. Now, what that did, it lowered the pressure in New York. You have five boroughs in New York: Queens, Brooklyn, etc. So it lowered the pressure on New York. In Mumbai, the problem has been that, in general, all of us, we are not very prone to change. We like status quo, right? We don't want difficulties in life, but we want life as it is. But life will never stay as it is. More population will come. Even in Mumbai, population will increase. People from Pune want to come to Mumbai. People from, let's suppose, the Konkan region of Maharashtra, they want to come to Mumbai. People from Gujarat, they want to come to Mumbai in order to realize their economic potential, and which is justified also. So that is where we need to keep track with time. Metro rail facility, the construction which is happening now at a breakneck speed, should have been completed at least 15 to 20 years back. At least. In New York, the subway system is more than 100 years old almost. So think about it. In Mumbai, what is the public transportation facility? The metro, the local trains. Local trains where on a daily basis you have at least 9 to 10 deaths happening on a daily basis on those local trains because it is so overcrowded. People simply fall down on the track, they get trampled and crushed to death. The best buses, which are so very polluting and they are so very dilapidated that basically they cause a lot of pollution. That is the public transportation. And just because I am giving you a comparison, I will give you a comparison here also. In the region of New York, when we talk about this public infrastructure of roads, highways, tram, or the rail lines, etc., it covers around 22% of the area of the city. 22%. Now, in Mumbai, around a decade back, that record, around a decade and a half back, that was close to 7%. Now, why is that relevant? That 22% of the area of that urban sphere is covered by roads, highways, etc. In Mumbai, you have only 7%. Because all the sewers, drainage system, right? The drainage pipings, etc. All the public amenities that you provide, they go underneath these highway networks. They go underneath the public road systems. So greater the area that you have under these public road and transportation system, more will be your amenities that you are providing. For example, from 2006, now you would have all come across that horrendous scenario. At least now you would have seen those in multiple documentaries and TV series, where Mumbai continued to get flooded every year. Recently, you had year before last year, you had a horrific case. Last year, in fact, you had a horrific case where a very well-renowned doctor in Mumbai, basically, the entire roads were flooded. Now the manholes were in the rainy season, they are opened up and everything is flooded. That poor chap, he fell into a manhole and was found 8 kilometers down somewhere else. So that is where basically Mumbai needs to keep track with it. And see, whenever there has, for example, even when Delhi Metro was being developed, many of you would be so very young to not recall any political discourse at that point of time. The amount of public opposition or the amount of opposition which was given to the Delhi Metro was humongous. That this is a system you are developing only for the rich. The poor people will never be able to travel on that. Delhi is a seismic zone. That means you are creating a scenario where mass deaths will happen. Delhi Metro is going to destroy everything. The buses will go out of service. Now the public transport, the auto wallahs will go out of business. What is the condition of Delhi Metro today? More than 350 kilometers of complete coverage and around 17 to 18 lakh daily ridership, around 20 lakh. Think about it. If those 20 lakh people would be on roads, think about the consequence, what Delhi would have looked like, what scale of pollution would we be talking about today. So if you build infrastructure today, it is going to yield you results many years. Now, Delhi Metro, the only unique thing was that at that point of time, you had the central government of another political party, and the state government of another political party. But both of them were aligned that we need to develop Delhi. So that is why, despite all this opposition and the court litigations, you had this project which took off, and people started looking at the benefits. And within 10 years, all the opposition subsided. In the case of Mumbai, sadly, that political consensus is not being arrived at. You still have the municipal corporation being dragged to the court on every weekly basis of sorts. So that is one of the kind of impediment, right? Now, then after that, Shargun, yes, that is a correct approach. But Shargun, as I would suggest, as Vaishna, I would suggest to you also that look, when you are analyzing the mains previous year question or the prelims previous year question, the portions of current affairs which were, let's suppose, in news in 2019 has been asked in 2020, don't judge your awareness on those particular topics, right? The questions of current affairs which are in news today, that will be relevant for you, not the questions of current affairs which were relevant in 2019, 2015, etc., 2012. Don't get bothered by those questions and those current affairs questions that, okay, this happened in 2012, I should. No, UPSC has not asked that question after 2012, has it? Because it was in news in 2012, it has asked in 2013. It was in news in 2015, UPSC has asked it in 2017. That's it. So when you analyze the mains previous year question, analyze it based upon the fact that, okay, in this year it was in news, that is why it was asked. Does not mean that all the previous year questions you should be by hearting. So this is where your approach should be different from the board exams. In board exams, what is the approach that you guys would have followed? Take the sample papers of last 10 years. If you are able to solve all the questions or all the sample papers, means you will be able to solve the board questions. Now that approach doesn't work for the dynamic portion, right? It might work for some of the static areas here and there, but it would never work for the dynamic portions. So analyze and judge the PYQs accordingly when you solve. Then Aditya, what are the issues coming because of Indian tourism to environment? Pollution due to lack of amenities. There is significant amount of pollution. And then Gayatri, Dubai does not have pure drinking water. Is it true? How they desalination, they carry out desalination in large amount. Dubai has very little amount of, the entire Emirate region has got very little amount of fresh water supply. That is true. Desalination plants are carried out in, and desalination process is carried out in large scale. So is the case with Israel also. So is the case with many other regions. But then understand, Dubai, even if, and the amount of money that the Middle East has, even if it requires fetching water from Mars, they would have enough money to do that also. If you have oil in such abundance and the world is hungry for oil, you can virtually do anything and everything, can you? But basically, when you implement it on a very large scale, the cost of production significantly comes down. We have started implementing few of the very innovative desalination methods in the region of Lakshadweep. We will have success associated with that also. Gaurav, increasing the width of highways to 12 meter against the norms of, see, in the case of the Char Dham infrastructure, we need to tackle it differently. We cannot follow the developmental approach, let's suppose, which is observed in the case of Alps in Europe. Most of the times when we think about infrastructure in Himalayas, we have a kind of a similarity that, okay, in Alps you do have this, we can have it here also. We don't do that. We cannot do that. Why is it the case? Because basically Himalayas are a young system. They are still a lot of sedimentary systems, unconsolidated rocks. So it is very fragile. So there, proper environmental impact and geological. So before any construction activities, those of you who have worked in construction sector would know this. Before any construction activity, you need a kind of a strength stock taking process where you take a look at the stability of the soil, stability of the rocks nearby, and then you carry out the construction accordingly. Now, infrastructure is required to be developed in Himalayas, no two way around it. You cannot have the region of the Himalayas as undeveloped or a no developed zone. But that development needs to be carried out in a very phased manner. It needs to be carried out in a way. Himalayas will still, maybe 50 years down the line, it will still experience those kind of landslides, etc. That is a reality. Even if you don't construct the highways, Himalayas will experience landslides. It is not the case that highways are being constructed, hence landslides are happening. It will happen. Otherwise, also it will happen. Build structures which are resilient, right? And that is very much required. Even for while the Konkan rail was getting constructed, there were a lot of such kind of events which happened. But look at the success of Konkan rail today, right? Now Konkan rail met with some severe accidents, some very severe accidents during the late 2000s, where a lot of people died in rail accidents because there was sudden landslide. But did they stop using that rail line? No. They developed a robust mechanism by which if there is a landslide, etc., they are warned accordingly. For example, in many countries of Europe, in many regions of New Zealand, for example, what is the policy which is used is that there are frequent surveys. The roads have been constructed in the fragile, wherever the roads have been constructed in the fragile areas, the fragile mountain areas, there are frequent surveys. Now, in those surveys, people are able to analyze that, okay, this is a region which is prone to landslide. You know, what do? They carry a very, very large stone or a boulder and they hang it to the bottom sling of the helicopter. And with that helicopter movement, they swing that stone, they drop it on the mountain with a heavy force. So that that unstable slope, which might have become unstable after heavy rain, whatever has to slide, slides, moves. And then the stable portion remains. And then you carry out, till that point of time, no person is allowed in that entire area. If the season is such that you can have multiple such activities of landslides, don't allow traffic in that area. So such kind of regulation is to be allowed, is to be followed if you want to follow development in these areas. Okay, right. So yes, Shargun, we have discussed few of the PYQs. Then about the protection of how important, not very important, that has been asked, used by UPSC earlier, only GR. Government knows the problem and solution to that, then also why the measures are. It is a implementation which has always been a problem in our country, my dear friend Kamal Pal. And artificial island building that the West Asian countries, how does it affect the coastal environment? It can basically impact significant areas in the region of coral reefs, critical coral ecosystems, etc. It can change the wave pattern, tidal pattern, which can impact many of the turtle species, etc. That can happen. Having said that, think about a city like Mumbai. Where will it expand? It cannot expand landwards, can it? So that is where you need some innovative developmental mechanism. Okay. So here basically we will discuss all these PYQs taken together, but let's complete this environmental impact assessment, and then after that we will only have the PYQs, and then we will only be having the portion of the questions that you have asked. Okay, Anurag, thank you, and humble gratitude for the kind words. I hope for all of you, I hope the session, the 11 sessions have been helpful for all of you. I hope you have extracted something beneficial. We will cover this EIA, and then after that, we will basically be discussing the PYQs and then only the questions that you have asked. Sri Lakshmi, the filter machines, that is a requirement, predicament of today. You cannot have anything else other than that. Right. Now, what is this concept of EIA? The concept of it. So, if let's suppose you are constructing a plant, an industry somewhere, now it will have an impact on the environment immediately close by. Right. It can have an impact on the environment at some far away distance as well. So, before carrying out that construction, Before moving ahead with that implementation, you need to carry out the environmental impact assessment. For example, just like we were talking about the Char Dham project. Now, Char Dham project is being built in that critical habitat or that very fragile ecosystem of Himalayas. You need to carry out a very detailed EIA, that what will be the impact 5 years down the line, what can be the impact immediately, what will be the impact on biodiversity, what will be the impact in terms of the drainage pattern, what will be the impact in terms of underground recharge of aquifers. So all those details you have to cater to, you have to ensure that they are in place, and then carry ahead with the process of construction. Now, if you basically track the history of it, EIA, the concept of it evolved in the 70s. Because remember, late 60s was the time when the environmental awareness was peaking. That was the time when Mar Conference 1962 was held, 1971 Ramsar Convention, 1972 Stockholm Conference, 1973 CITES, then 1979 CMS. So environmental awareness was peaking in the 70s. That is when the US introduced the EIA through NEPA, National Environment Policy Act. Then, late 1970s and early 1980s, these guidelines became much more formalized. Developing nations started introducing the EIA. Now, then mid 1980s, World Bank established the EIA requirement, and that process started gaining prominence in India also. That process became popular in India also. India formally adopted EIA in the 1990s, and from that point of time, EIA has been the norm. The objective of it: identifying, predicting, and evaluating environment, economic, and social impact of any developmental activity which is being carried on, providing information on the environmental consequences for decision making, promoting environmentally sound and suitable development by identifying appropriate alternatives and mitigation measures. Right? So that in simplest of the terms, whatever construction, whatever project you are implementing, what is the impact of it? So the process of it, if you draw the flow chart of it, so first of all, let's suppose I have selected a site that in this area I have to construct something. Now, first of all, carry out the EIA, environmental impact assessment. Earlier, it used to be carried out by, let's suppose I am IOCL, let's suppose Indian Oil. Now, I have to build a refinery. Now, earlier, it used to be the case that the ministry would appoint another agency, they would carry out the assessment, and according to the assessment, the rest of the processes will take place. What it led to was a scenario where you had certain agencies which started coming up. For example, let's suppose you have opened a startup. Now, I know that you carry out EIA. I am, let's suppose, Shell, the Shell Petrol. I don't want IOCL to do something. I will give you some amount of money. And you carry out an EIA and you say that that site is the worst. It will lead to the destruction of the environment. So you had conflict of interest issues which started coming up. So the government, what it did in the latest notification of 2020, it said that if I am Indian Oil, my agency can carry out the EIA. Now think about it. In order to remove that conflict of interest, a larger level of conflict of interest has been brought in. That is, if my agency will carry out environmental impact assessment, will it ever say that don't construct here? No. It will always say that, okay, these are the problems, but we can do this to solve it. So that is one of the changes. We'll take a look at it. Then applied for no objection certificate. Now, State Pollution Control Board arranges for a public hearing where the public of that area, any kind of issue that they have, any kind of issue that they face, they basically can bring it to the table. They can bring it to the fore. Okay. Then earlier, that duration was long. 60 days was the time period where the public could bring up the issues. As per the changes brought about, now that has been reduced to around 45 days. Now, this met with a lot of opposition that you are curbing the voice of dissent, etc. But frankly speaking, 45 days is more than sufficient if you want to bring in a position to it. But the counter argument is that if you want to bring a detailed and informed opposition to it, or a kind of an objection you want to bring to the table, you need an analysis, you need a proper study, and for that you need some time. So there are both sides of the coin. Now, project proponent, they apply for the environmental clearance, submitting these certificates. Now it is reviewed by the Environment Appraisal Committee. Then either that project will be accepted, or if the impact is quite vicious, it might be rejected. Or let's suppose there are changes suggested in the project that, okay, this site is not working, make it carry out in this site, or this kind of a project won't work, change the nature of your project. Then again, you will conduct the EIA, and again, this process will continue. Now, the EIA norms of 2006, as was declared, that became a kind of a bottleneck. Pick up any newspaper from the year 2010 to 2012, 13, any newspaper. You had close to around 15 to 17 lakh crores worth of project, which was stuck because the clearance was not being provided by the Environment Ministry. Because this loop would continue. This loop would continue. Many of the project proponents, they withdrew from India, that we won't invest. It is not worth our time and money anymore. So Environment Ministry was always thought to be a bottleneck. Nobody was passing the files because it was the norms were so stringent, you would end up contravening some or the other of them. So the government that brought about a kind of an amendment in that 2020, thereby it diluted the norms so significantly. While it is referred to be or said to be business friendly, but it leaves many different loopholes which can be exploited by the business, by the industrialists, and that can be exploited, which can harm the environment. Down to Earth has carried a detailed study about it, where in how many different areas the EIA norms have been violated in the past couple of years. Okay, so here, as per the notification, reduced time for public hearings. As I told you, the time period for public hearings earlier used to be 60 days. But ever since the COVID pandemic, government said that in COVID pandemic, anyways, everything is happening online. Reduce it to less than 45 days. Classification of projects has been done. Many of the projects have been given exemption, that you don't require that much amount of certification. Post clearance compliance, that is, after you have got the clearance, EIA clearance, are you complying with the environmental norms, or are you still violating the environmental norms? So for that, the new EIA proposes the submission of compliance report annually. As an industry, you support the compliance report annually. Earlier, you had the case that the industries had to submit it every 6 months. That meant a lot of paperwork, more paperwork, lack of transparency in many of the cases. So you would have to have a separate expenditure for that. So the government said that basically we are smoothing it out. But the counter argument is that you are smoothing it out. You are basically making it easier for the companies now to exploit that. They can basically violate the norms for a long time, and they can submit the report annually. So that is the other side of the argument. Now, report is prepared solely, the EIA report is prepared solely by the project proponents. Now, this brings into existence conflict of interest. Okay, another reminder for you, the feedback sheets, I hope, have been rolled out or will be rolled out to you. You have to fill that also, right? Now, coming back to it. EIA notification 2020 excludes reporting of violations and non-compliance by the public. And here is granting post facto clearance. That is, a project that has been operating without environmental clearance, a project has been operating. In that case, they can be regularized or they can allow for clearance. So that in case, let's suppose the clearance process has been very long, 3 years, 2 years, 3 years, by that time you have started running the operation, you needed the finances, so you can apply for clearance after that. But the counter argument is that in those 2 to 3 years, you might very well have destroyed every iota of environment which was there. Firms found violating the terms of their establishment, if they have to get the clearance, however, will have to pay a penalty. Now, here also the counter argument is basically that the destruction of the environment, which is being caused by the firms, you are simply telling the firms that, okay, give us money and everything will be normalized. But the argument on the side of the government is, let's suppose someone has polluted the environment, does not mean immediately that is the end of the business. You should allow them a kind of a corrective measure. A course correction should be allowed. For that, we are charging a very heavy penalty. So these are the EIA norms of 2020. UPSC has already asked a direct question from this in 2021. A direct question about these norms has been asked in the mains examination. So there are very few chances that this will be asked over again. Okay. So now the exempted projects, where you see offshore and onshore gas and shale explorations, they are exempted. Hydroelectric projects up to 25 milliwatts, they are exempted. Irrigation projects between 2000 to 10,000 hectares of command area, exempted. Inland waterway projects, right? So roads that cut through the forest or dredging of major rivers, that is also exempted. Specified building construction and area development of around 1,50,000 square kilometer is exempted. So basically, for infrastructure, for the developmental activities, many of the areas have been exempted. And the argument is we are doing that for economic growth, but the counter argument is that can be misutilized for a kind of environmental degradation. So what is the way forward? What is the way forward in this? You have to analyze each and every case on a case by case basis. If earlier, let's suppose there was a hiccup in the environment ministry, let's suppose a region has got a lot of traffic jams, does not mean that you provide green signal forever there, right? So that means you need to go for a careful approach, smoothen that clearance process. Wherever there is a hindrance, smoothen that, so that case by case basis you are able to expedite that clearance. That clearance does not take a long period of time. Okay, so that is basically the way forward in this particular scenario. Now we come to the portion of the PYQs where we will be discussing the PYQs itself. And do we take a break before that, or do we start the discussion of the PYQs? Okay, break. Fair enough. So we take a break, and after that, we will be discussing these PYQs, and then the questions that you have sent over, we'll be discussing those questions also. Okay, so let's take a break. What Rio Plus 20 about? Meeting for the of the WTO. It is a conference of the IPCC. It is a conference of CBD. What is Rio Plus 20 about? Now, again, this was a question of current affairs at that point of time. Yes. Femina, Pumalai, Vani, many of for you, the PPTs would be more than sufficient. You don't need to recap all the videos. So here it is A, that is United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. Then after that, biological oxygen demand is a standard criteria for measuring oxygen levels in blood, computing oxygen levels in forest ecosystem, pollution assay in aquatic ecosystems, assessing oxygen levels in high altitude regions. They are very generic in approach, but Vaishna has actually raised one of the important questions. I will tackle that. That what if you come across a very factual question like the Gothenburg Protocol? So sometimes these factual questions are also asked in the mains. So in this, yes, most of you are correct in this. The answer is going to be C. So that is pollution assay in aquatic ecosystem. Then, Cricket Lake, Areals basically are found to be in the region of fresh water, generally found in the bringing about programs to bring that into implementation and improve the population in these areas. In Wildlife Act 1972, what does it protection, and it is impossible to are we almost all of you are correct in this, other than Anushka and Vani. Schedule 1 means maximum conservation protection, that is the same level of protection as the tiger. The term intended national or affected Middle East investment bank, in this case, Akshita. So INDC, as per the Paris Agreement, is the intended nationally determined contribution that each of the countries declare on their own. Which of the following statements is or are correct? And poverty, forests to remain if you don't cut the forest. So the ecosystem services from the forest will also help in poverty alleviation of and for sustainable development. Correct answer in this case is going to be D. With reference to Agenda 21, some correct in this case on sustainable development, it originated in the Rio Summit. So the first statement is correct. So the correct answer will be A. Okay. Agenda 21 were amongst the three documents which were finalized in Rio Summit. You had the Forest Principle, Agenda 21, as well as the Rio Declaration. Development goals were initially proposed in Rio Plus 20, but then after that, the finalization of the SDG happened in 2015, and SDGs have to be achieved by 2030. So the correct answer in this case will be 2 only. In the grasslands, forming of the above. Different question associated very similar to that, which was asked in the portion of geography, also in the prelims also. So UPSC has asked this question, this kind of a question multiple times about the portion of the grasslands, where limited availability of water and frequent forest fire, influence of species like elephants, etc., that does not allow the trees to grow very easily. Which one of the following terms describes not only the physical space occupied by an organism, but also its functional role in the community of organisms? Even if, let's suppose, not all of you, but 69% have you rendered it correct, it is an ecological niche. Now, even if, let's suppose, your logic of micro weather, when you have storm, cloudy conditions, etc., in a year, highest level of ozone pollution occurred during the periods of inclement weather. PM10 can penetrate the lung barrier and enter the bloodstream. Excessive ozone in the air can trigger asthma. Options in a year, highest level of ozone pollution. Ozone pollution is created when you have the availability of sunlight, right? Sunlight is not available during inclement weather. It is only during the sunlight when that reaction will take place, which will lead to formation of ground level ozone. PM10 can penetrate the lung barrier and enter the bloodstream. No, you have only PM2.5 which can do that. PM10 is too large to do that. Excessive ozone in the air can trigger asthma. This is correct. 4 is correct. 1 is correct. Right? 2 and 3 are, 2 and 3 are incorrect. So you can use the elimination. If that elimination option is still justifiable in that question, you can do that. Otherwise, that is where you can think about that. Either you can restrict it to the number of options. Following lines. Which of them can your yes? Telephone lines. Telephone lines will never be able to generate magnetite particles. If that would have been the case, why would you need to have any other source for magnetite? So iron particles? No. Power plants will have that. Telephone lines will also not have that. What is blue carbon? Natural gas. It is perpetually available in high quantities in the region of grasslands. So that is not a limiting factor why the trees don't grow. You don't have those many trees because the conditions are very, very dry. Activities, 81% of you have got this correct. Blue carbon, craters of active volcanoes. Collecting breath samples from spouting whales. Spouting whales basically is when the whales come out, they release a lot of air and vapor particles along with them. So collecting breath samples from the spouting whales for DNA analysis. At the present level of technology, which of the above activities can be successfully carried out using drone? And all of them can be done with the help of the drone tech. Yes, this is also 2022 question. This is 2021 question. Which of the following are the reasons or the factors for polyurethane give rise to? benzene exposure and eventual benzene pollution. Lichens, which are capable of initiating ecological succession even on bare rocks, are actually a symbiotic association of. Yes. Ananya, I hope that the lichens. Basically bolsters you to increase your level of preparation. So here, most of you are correct. It is algae and fungi. The ocean of fresh water is found in atmosphere as moisture and clouds is found in fresh water seconds. Femina. Take a few more PY is where you have almost 30% of the fresh water. Ice caps is where you have almost 70% of the fresh water. Okay. And then we'll take a few more PYQs. So, which of the following national parks is unique of being a swamp with a floating vegetation that supports a rich biodiversity? So, please, it is basically Kebulimyao, which is present in the region of Manipur, where in Manipur you have the Loktak Lake, where also some amount of centripetal drainage happens. So here you have this floating vegetation, and these floating vegetation, they are known as by the name Fumdis. And here you find a very unique kind of a deer species also. That is what is the name of that deer species? Which is so very light on its feet, it can basically jump from one vegetation to another. So you have the dancing deer or the Sangai deer. Dancing deer. Yogita, only the one which is there in the portion of current affairs, keep on covering that. It was there in the portion of current affairs that year. Marine animal, it is a very logical. Yes, Gulam. And also in the very good. So here it is found along the entire coast of India will be incorrect. It is found in the region of Gulf of Mannar. It is found in the region around Nicobar. So that is where it is found. So rest two of the statements are correct in this case. Which of the following is the national aquatic animal of India? This should hardly take 15 seconds. And Gharial. If in this less than 50% of you get it correct, it will be a shame. Very good. 81% of you got it correct. It is Gangetic dolphin. Dams and for the decline in population of the dolphins. Crocodiles has got nothing to do with the dolphins. So here again, majority of you are correct. It is 1, 3, and 4. Other than the portion of crocodile, everything is correct. In a particular region in India, the local people train the roots of the living trees into robust bridges across the streams. As the time passes, these bridges get stronger. These are your very unique living root bridges. Now, these unique living root bridges are found in Meghalaya, a very tedious task. So if you have questions that you will be confronted with many of the times. Okay. So that is the objective PYQs basically. So here, if you take a look at it, I will show you the leaderboard also. So Ravi, Shamil, Divya, Mary, Akshita, Jayakanan, Aniket, Tehseen, you have got it all correct. Then comes Karthik, Anushri, Vaishna, Alenta, Soumya, Jia, all of it. So good. Very nice. So here, basically, now if you take a look at the few of the PYQs, basically, look at the trend here. Describe the major outcomes. Okay, so those who have done one wrong, I think the system did not capture that. Describe the major outcomes of the 26th session of COP to the UNFCCC. What are the commitments made by India in the conference? Now, this question, why did it come? It came because you had the question or you had the Panchamrit commitments that India actually made. So that is where those Panchamrit commitments that India made, that is something that was relevant that year. So Major outcomes. So we have discussed about the key initiatives to ban deforestation by 2030. To basically the global methane pledge was announced to cut 30% of the methane emissions as compared to 2020 levels by the year 2030. So here in the introduction you have to write that the 26th session of COP was held in Glasgow, and this was the session for United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Discussions about the issue of climate change were paramount, and various initiatives were taken in order to combat the level of warming across the planet. So these generic statements, for a brief, you write. After that, straight away go for the initiatives taken by India to achieve net zero status by 2070, to increase the non-renewable, or increase the renewable energy generation by around 500 gigawatts by 2030, and so on. You can basically talk about this. Okay. Now, what is a wetland? Explain the Ramsar concept of wise use in the context of wetland conservation. Cite two examples of Ramsar sites from India. So this is about that, again, in the simplest of the terms. What is a wetland? So it is a kind of a region where you have, across the land areas, across the terrestrial ecosystem, you have standing water which is present, where you can have the growth of the plants also, and lot of organic biodiversity is to be found in that area. Ramsar Convention also, you mentioned a couple of words about it, that it is about the conservation of the wetlands, wise uses, about the sustainable utility of the wetlands. Okay. Kumari, in that case, if you don't know about the source of benzene pollution, see, daily newspaper reading will give you some idea, but still, I would not be so impractical to say that you will be able to solve all the questions. There will be certain questions in that case which maybe you are not very sure. So in case you are at a 50-50 kind of level that it might be correct, incorrect, attempt them after you have attempted the 50 basic questions of the prelims. After that, attempt those particular things. In most of them, unless and until it is an easy elimination, you will go for all of them. Okay. Do knowing all the Ramsar sites hold relevance? No. Right? Absolutely not. Only the latest additions. Climate change is a global problem. How will India be impacted by climate change? How Himalayan and coastal states of India will be affected by climate change? So here, in the intro, you have to write about that climate change refers to the sudden and rapid change and the warming of the climate that is experienced in the present context due to the anthropogenic activities. The impact of it is felt in terms of food production, in terms of water scarcity, and in terms of unusual climate activities across the globe. That will be your initial portion. Then Himalayan and coastal states. How will the Himalayan states be impacted? Himalayan states, greater events of cloudbursts. Greater events of cloudbursts means more amount of landslides, greater melting of ice and snow. As a result of that, more avalanches, flash floods again in that region. The ecosystem will become very fragile in those areas, right? Then as a result of that, the rivers, the flow of water in those rivers will become discontinuous in a way, right? And the Himalayan states are also experiencing much drier conditions nowadays, due to which, for example, the drinking water streams in the region around, let's suppose Sikkim, Manipur, etc., they have dried up because of the sporadic occurrence of rainfall. Coastal states, more occurrence of tropical cyclones, coastal flooding will be observed. Rising sea level will impact the coastal ecosystem also. So that is basically the approach that is required to be covered. Trick to learn important national parks. Go for the state-wise analysis in that case, but just browse through and that is the website that I have provided, Sachin. Just look at that. Avalanche basically, Sudaresh, refers to when you have a large scale unconsolidated ice and snow, when they start falling down the slope with an incredible speed. Now that will generally fall into a lake or into a river, causing glacial lake flood in that area, or can cause flash flood in a certain area. What is oil pollution? What are its impacts on the marine ecosystem? So oil pollution, we do know that when you have, let's suppose, the spill or the dumping of oil in the marine ecosystem. Now, that is a major problem experienced and has been experienced for a long time across the global waters due to the trade of oil happening through the sea routes. Now, its impact on the marine ecosystem, it can lead to coral bleaching. It can lead to a significant amount of creation of hypoxic waters. It can prevent the air water exchange because the oil floats on top of that. It can reduce the level of dissolved oxygen in the water. It can get deposited as a slick material on many of the marine organisms, reducing their ability to survive. All that you can bring into the picture. In what way is oil pollution particularly harmful for a country like India? We have a very large coastal ecosystem. Already, the region of Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea have hypoxic waters. Oil spill in that area or oil pollution can lead to substantial issues. Now, this oil and the pollutant of the oil, it continues to remain in the region, then it can reach the coastline also. It can damage the coastal ecosystem, particularly the fragile species which live across the coastal ecosystem. That is something which you can elaborate. If you are doing that, Shargun, on a daily basis, more than sufficient, right? And so that is where here the solution is not asked, but if you have scope, if you have the space available in the answer, you can write that bioremediation technique, skimmers basically, they separate the oil from the surface. All these can also be utilized. IPCC has predicted a global sea level rise of about 1 meter by 2100 AD. What could be its impact on India? Basically, if the seawater is going to rise, then the coastal flooding will be very imminent and very frequent. You will also have the fragile ecosystem across the coastline meeting the sudden death. Many areas will be submerged, leading to mass migrations. The fertile areas getting submerged means there will be impact on food production and the food security of the region. So these are the points that you have to highlight in these areas. Okay. Now, that basically marks the end of the entirety of this module. Now we will take up the questions that you guys have raised, the questions that you have sent it over. So we'll start with the question sent by Harsh. Harsh, okay, Gia, in 2020, there was a question on cellulose, the natural process that it undergoes. So there you have to talk about the phases of degradation and decomposition. That's it. Right, that is the best that you can do. You don't have to go into the biological aspect of the breaking of cellulose, etc. That is simply not required, just the basic aspect. Okay, right. And thanks for the kind words, very kind words, Vaishna. I hope that this learning continues, and I hope over a period of time, I will have more opportunity to help you guys, guide you guys. So the first question is basically from Harsh. Couple of questions. So Harsh, if you are there in the session, yes. So when we throw any biodegradable garbage, then after some time, tiny organisms are seen over it. But those organisms do not appear to come via any route. So see, many of the fungal species, for example, they end up getting transmitted from one region to another with the help of vectors also, right? Ants, for example, the fungal species will be able to get transmitted with the help. Spores, those reproduction with the help of spores, so they are carried by the wind also. So that also, and microbes, many of the times they are in a dormant state in a particular area, so that also initiates decomposition in that region. Abhishek, it would be an absolute honor, and thanks for that. Is there no harm to soil or land in sanitary landfills at all? No, I would not say that there is no harm or at all. Sometimes some leachate does get there, but that impact is substantially limited to a very small area on the top. It is in the landfill where the leachate problem is very significant. And Harsh, you have a question which many of you have shared, that is, after the completion of the course, if any concept would be missing or won't be able to be recalled, then which source is to be relied upon? I hope you will have the annotations of the PPT which you can download. So you can take a look at that. And but you guys have my mail ID also. Feel free to get in touch. I won't always be able to reply to you immediately. See, some of you would attest to the fact that you send me a mail, I get back to you within, let's say, 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But in certain cases, it does take me some time. So you have my mail ID. So you can basically send me over. And then I have set of questions sent by Ragini. What is polar Arctic vortex? Okay, Samiksha, I'll write my mail ID also. So, what is polar Arctic vortex? Ragini, polar Arctic vortex is a complex atmospheric phenomena taking place in the northern region of the polar area. It happens because of a stratospheric high pressure which builds in that area. Now, that stratospheric high pressure, when it builds over, what it does is basically it increases the pressure here, and the polar winds, they become very, very dominant. As the polar winds become very dominant, the cold polar mass that starts spreading around, because when you have a high pressure, you will always find a Coriolis force, which, like a vortex, the winds will basically move around. Now, there they will impact the jet streams also. The jet streams will get very weakened in many of the areas. And this cold wind reaches the lower latitudes, taking the temperature in the mid latitudes to sub freezing level. That is the polar Arctic vortex. Okay, right? Okay, and by the way, before a few of you leave, so basically, I want to judge your comfort level based on the analysis of the PYQs. Are you comfortable, including Vivek and Vaishnav, who have sent around 30 questions based on PYQs? Are you comfortable in this, or is there any concern which still persists? Please let me know. So, Ravi, that is what the polar vortex is. Polar vortex is that high pressure created all the way from that region of stratosphere, and where the wind starts sinking, that high pressure basically exists. And see, the jet streams will be formed. The jet streams basically form a partition between the warm air and the cold air. So, as the cold air starts spreading around in all the various different areas, that will be reaching the regions such as around 30 even 40, 50 degrees north latitude, and that will cause sub-freezing condition, right? And right, I got 3 PYQ wrong. It's okay. See, it is, please don't get worried at this point of time in your preparation. Please don't get worried that I got a PYQ wrong. That should not be the concern. The concern is, or what your agenda should be, that if I revise it, am I comfortable? First of all, I'm comfortable in understanding the question. Am I able to understand where have I made a mistake? So if that kind of a question is asked, if that from that portion again a question is asked from a derived concept, will I be able to do that or not? That should be the purpose. So many of you will be appearing for the prelims test series. I suggest all of you appear for the prelims test series. You will get many of the questions incorrect. Many of the factual questions have been said there. Now, deliberately few of the factual questions have been put there in order to provide you with certain amount of factual knowledge also, right? Standing here, if I start handing out facts to you, from yesterday we have been handing out facts in terms of international organizations. Most of you, basically, the things flew over your head. So that is not the way to go. So basically, when you when you attempt those PYQs, make a short note about it, that these are the facts that you need to be concerned about. Revise it, my dear friend. Revise it once or twice, and pay attention to the revision for the first 6 modules. First 6 modules, they hold the crux. And those modules, if you are comfortable, rest of them is simply a derivative of that. Gulam, for that, I have suggested you once again, that is basically the in climatology. I hope you have the pre-recorded lectures in the tablet lectures also. Start with the basics of climatology one by one, form the concepts, draw it in a piece of paper with your own hand. That is the solution. Okay. And yes, Yogita, PPT will be sufficient, right? Divya, you had a PYQ about Purvaya in Bihar. Purvaya, translated, Purvaya refers to an eastward move of wind coming from eastern direction. Now, during the monsoons, the Bay of Bengal branch of monsoon is the one which reaches Bihar. Now, Bay of Bengal branch of monsoon has to come from which direction to influence Bihar? Obviously, from the eastward direction, isn't it? So that is why it basically has got that Purvaya aspect. So it brings rain, it lowers the temperature in that area. So break down the question. Have that confidence amongst you. So where does that kind of fear comes from? The fact is, when many of the candidates, they have that lack of confidence that maybe I have not read something. So maybe a question has been asked from that, and how will I tackle that? Remove that hesitation from your mind. You have covered almost everything, right? As much as you can cover. Trust me, you have covered more content in the portion of environment and geography together as compared to more than 99.9% of the candidates. Interact with your competitors. Maybe they will be knowing one fact or the other slightly here and there, but if you analyze the PYQs, those facts are not very relevant. The concepts that you know, I can assure you with a guarantee that you have an edge, provided you revise that, provided you are very sure with the concepts that we have covered. That confidence, if you have, then you will have the confidence to break down the question in the mains and the prelims also. That is very much required. The entire game is about confidence, my dear friend. If you lack confidence, you will have so many negative marks and you will have so much hesitation in the mains. You will lose time. Have confidence that, yes, I have covered. There's no reason why I should not be able to attempt that. You will be able to solve that. Right? And no, Kamlesh, should not always be highlighted. Then why, according to ozone recovery assessment report of 2022, the thickness of ozone layer to return to 1980 values around, because why thickness of ozone layer to return to 1980 values around 2066 in the Antarctic and around 2025 in the Arctic region? That is because in different areas, you have different levels of depletion of ozone. So it is not going to be the case that, okay, this is the New Year time, so let's have the recovery of the entire region. Tropics would recover much earlier, right? Arctic would recover a bit later because you have in the low temperature conditions, you still have some amount of accumulated CFCs. So it will take some time. Antarctic will take even more time because in Antarctic, the ozone hole or the depletion created is going to be much more prominent also. Okay. Should I have to read book? No, Saraswati, no. So, Chandrasekhar, even if some subjects are not covered till now, just ensure that you are basically, whatever you have covered, you carry out multiple revisions in them. Okay, so that by the time that you finish all the other subjects, your preparation is well on track. Sovereign carbon, basically, Ragini, the sovereign carbon, the concept of it is that by the aspect of preventing deforestation as per the Red Plus campaign, if let's suppose you prevent deforestation, you will be able to save significant amount of carbon emission. And that is basically the carbon which is referred to as a sovereign carbon. Okay. And Shubhangi, technology transfer is basically when you, let's suppose you have a technology, US has got, let's suppose, a technology to have a very efficient electric battery which can be used for electric vehicles. Now India has got a problem of pollution in transportation. Transportation emissions are very high in India. So if US transfers that technology to India, we will be able to manufacture electric vehicles at a very low cost. But US doesn't do so. Why? Because then it will lose its economic edge over the other nations, and US sees India as a kind of a direct competitor in this area. That is why the developed countries are reluctant to do so. Shubhangi, then despite widely shared views on quality of environment, interaction amongst international communities suffer due to lack of collective action? Can a balance be achieved? Over a period of time, I think it will. All the countries are initiating a movement towards that balanced environmental movement and balanced environmental emission and care. So that is the general movement, direction of movement that you observe. So you have to be hopeful for the future, but that will come into place as developed countries take more responsibility. Otherwise, eventually it will come. It comes at what cost? Eventually, when all the countries, they start developing economically, eventually they will reach a kind of a proficient level where the emissions level will reduce. The newer tech that you are developing, going to develop, will always be climate friendly. Now nobody is going to develop a technology that, okay, if you burn fuel so much, you will have the engine that much efficient. No. For example, if you even take the case of few of the elite sports such as Formula One, which has always been fuel guzzling, even they are moving to electric and hybrid systems. So the future is towards climate friendly system. We have to see how much time it takes. Okay, and then after that, do countries free ride on other countries' efforts? They do. They do. And they free ride on other countries' efforts to reduce emissions and continue using fossil fuels to feed. So they basically, for example, China is still doing so. But take a look at what Germany and European countries are doing right now. As the Russian gas supply has been stopped, they are resorting to burning of coal now. Germany has shut down all the nuclear power plants ever since the Fukushima nuclear disaster took place in Japan. Now, as a consequence of that, why did it do so? Because it wanted the political support of the the eco-friendly party, and that is where Germany basically had shut down. Angela Merkel ordered the shutdown of the nuclear plants. Now they are burning fossil fuels. Now they can stand up and say that China and India are also doing that. US is also doing that. So why do we not do that? So that is always the case. And can we say that after 2050, when emerging economies like India and China have a substantial level of development, climate change will slow down? Absolutely, yes. Gulam, how to analyze the PYQs for examination? As I told you, as we have had the uh, detailed discussion about it, basically, when we talk about the PYQs, always the understanding should be that the static portion, am I able to solve? And am I able to understand the language that is used by UPSC to trick the candidates? If you have proficiency in that, fair enough. Then Soumya Devi, why forest ecosystem exhibits rhomboidal shape of pyramids of number? Because at the bottom you have one tree, right? One tree will support a few number of birds. That will support basically few number of insects. That will support few number of birds, and eventually an apex predator of bird. That is why a rhomboidal one. If allogenic succession is always driven by abiotic components of ecosystem, yes. Do Arab countries agree with zero fossil fuel goal? Absolutely not. That is why this Conference of Parties 28 has been so terse and so tensed. Difference between BOD and COD, Soumya, basically BOD or biological oxygen demand is the total amount of oxygen required to decompose all the organic materials in the water body. COD is the total amount of oxygen required to decompose both organic and inorganic contaminants of the water body. So COD will always be more. Construction waste, etc., will come under inorganic waste. So all of them, if you have to disintegrate them, decompose them over a period of time, that is the oxygen level required is COD. If ground ozone is always associated with, so for formation of photochemical smog, formation of ground level ozone is one of the key intermediary stages. Is there a connection between ozone hole and global warming? When you have more ultraviolet rays hitting the Earth's surface due to the creation of ozone hole, ultraviolet rays has got higher amount of energy level. So it will always heat up the surface. And if you have the presence of gases, then the terrestrial radiation will be trapped more. Okay, and Aniket, how acid rain can impact the atmosphere? It basically can see acid rain in atmosphere, when you have large number of these small, even dry deposits or wet deposit particles, that can always influence the water cycle also, that can influence the species living there, the plants which absorb that air from atmosphere, they will be impacted by it. Then concept of EPR, it is said that producer and importer is responsible for collecting and treatment of waste. Why some part of the waste is, the government takes care of a lot of waste as per the municipal government, municipal departments, they do take care of that. But when it comes to the e-waste, when it comes to, so you have to promote responsible production eventually. And only way that the companies will go for a responsible level of production is if they have to cater to their own waste management. Then they will realize that, okay, let's use eco-friendly products. So it is, the EPR is a way to nudge these companies to go for eco-friendly production. Biodiversity hotspot, Aniket, is basically those areas where the amount of biodiversity that you find on the ground is going to be very substantial, very large number, right? So there are two conditions: at least 1500 vascular species of plants to be found, and that area should have suffered at least 70% of the loss of biodiversity. So at least 1500 original species or endemic species of plants should be found in that area. That is a necessary requirement. The various types of convention protocol agreements, how to get a hand of it, take a A4 sheet paper, write it year wise. International conventions in one side, start from the Stockholm Convention, and then talk about the portion of national legislations. Now, international conventions, let's suppose UNFCCC. UNFCCC, what are the protocols? The Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, Montreal Protocol, the amendments in a separate page, UNFCCC in a separate page. So like that, you will have 3 to 4 pages of A4 sheet paper. Revisit them every 10 to 15 days, more than sufficient. Okay. And Nutan, can acid rain be man-made? Yes, absolutely. If you spread certain chemicals, aircraft pollution, etc., they can lead to acid rain, always. Ecosystem engineers, Sirti, is basically, when we talk about ecosystem engineers, these are those particular species which modify the ecosystem around them in order to adapt, in order to live and survive. They end up modifying the ecosystem around them. So these are your ecosystem engineers, right? So for example, a plant, when it grows into a tree, it will have different kind of ecosystem. A small plant has got a different ecosystem around it, different species, different biotic factors around it. But when it grows into an adult mango tree or a jackfruit tree, it will have all sort of different mechanisms working for it. Different larger species will come there, different set of decomposers, parasites will come there, right? So these are your autogenic. And then, for example, you also have ecosystem engineers such as beavers, which physically they will be able to build a dam for the growth of, for the stagnation of the fresh water, where they can raise their young ones. Okay. Then Vani Jain, what is the difference between national parks and wildlife sanctuaries? So wildlife sanctuaries generally are species specific. National parks, you are able to conserve the larger landscape. When we talk about the national parks, the level of protection is much higher. In the case of wildlife sanctuaries, the number of protection is lesser. And then Varun. Varun, are you there in the session? So do let me know if you are there in the session. Then I will, after that, I have the Herculean task of around 30 set of questions which have been sent by Vaishna and Vivek. So Varun, are you there in the session? Do let me know. Then I will take up your questions. So before that, I will take up the questions by Vani. I have taken your question. Now I come to the questions of Vaishna, first of all. Basically, one of the responses to abiotic factor is regulation, whereby some organisms can maintain homeostasis by physiological and sometimes behavioral means. What physiological means thermoregulation and osmoregulation. Behavioral, basically, they try to become, let's suppose, nocturnally active. They tend to go for a certain kind of mechanism in terms of food eating habits. Sometimes they are able to slow down their metabolism rate. That is the case. Okay. So, okay, remaining of you whose doubt has been addressed, who don't have any doubts anymore. So, for all of you, please, that will be the end of the session. So there is no point lingering around. But if you want to understand what are the questions which are being asked, which are being addressed, please do stay around.